1900 to 1909, the first decade of the new century ushered in bold new ways of thinking to spell the dawning of a new remarkable age. American President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, and his funeral, one of the first state occasions caught on film, set a somber tone for the new century. Teddy Roosevelt, who had become president upon McKinley's death, was elected in 1904 and inaugurated in 1905. Roosevelt promptly embarked on his pet project, a canal through the Isthmus of Panama to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Work on the Panama Canal consisted of back-breaking manual labor through the hot jungles of Central America. In 1905, delegates from Russia and Japan met in Portsmouth, Maine, to negotiate an end to their war in Asia. The first decade saw a surge in immigration from Europe to the United States. The new arrivals flooded the bustling cities of the eastern seaboard, often suffering cramped ghetto conditions. The rise in immigration created a pool of labor for U.S. factories. Industrialist Henry Ford developed a new concept, mass production, and his Model T assembly lines revolutionized the way people worked. Ford shrewdly priced his cars so that his workers could afford them, creating a mass market. As the next decade approached, Americans were off and running. World War I raged for 5 years across 3 continents, leaving devastation and the innocence of an entire generation in its wake. World War I shaped the decade as country after country was drawn into the conflict. The Titanic, touted as the safest ship in the world, sank in 1912 after hitting an iceberg. The lifeboat shortage was most acute for those passengers traveling in the steerage compartments. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, was hailed as a feat of modern engineering. Woodrow Wilson was re-elected President of the United States in 1916 on a pledge to keep America out of war. Wilson sent troops to Mexico to apprehend the elusive Pancho Villa, who had conducted raids against American citizens. The troops returned from Mexico without even a glimpse of Pancho Villa. Less than a year later, American troops would file off to fight in World War I. Seeking a diversion from the mounting tensions in Europe, audiences flocked to see the latest silent movie releases. The charismatic film star Rudolph Valentino stole the hearts of female viewers. The antics of the Keystone Cops defined comedy on the silver screen for a generation. The United States ended World War I in 1917. This first truly global conflict consisted of harrowing trench warfare and the first use of tanks, airplanes, and submarines. The Americans tipped the balance, and Germany surrendered on November 11, 1918. Over 1 million American troops had fought in Europe, and their homecoming was cause for a heartfelt celebration. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, but discontent among the signatories sowed the seeds of conflict that would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War II. 1920 to 1929. The 20s were a period of gaiety and daring. The Great War was over, and the jazz age rushed in to make up for lost time, throwing caution to the wind. The dance craze was the Charleston. With short hair and shorter hems, women were liberated from tradition and convention. Charles Lindbergh flew the first solo flight over the Atlantic in 1927 in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. An instant international hero, Lindbergh was honored with parades, medals, and glowing commentary. Dubbed the Lone Eagle by the press, he was cheered all the more for his quiet personality. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages was illegal during the 20s. But prohibition created the fierce demand for liquor, and speakeasies flourished. Patrons flocked to the clandestine establishments to enjoy a drink, dance, and watch a show. Prohibition also advanced the careers of gangsters like Al Capone. Herbert Hoover was elected President of the U.S. in 1928. That same year, the Kellogg-Briand Act was signed, condemning war. Hoover could not have foreseen the stock market crash at the decade's end that brought the prosperity of the 20s to a screeching halt. Suddenly, the party was over. 1930 to 1939. America's Great Depression reached across the world, creating an economic catastrophe that paved the way for fascism and the greatest war the world had ever known. Massive unemployment, at times reaching as high as 1/3 of the workforce, put thousands on bread lines in a desperate search for food. The rural areas of Middle America experienced droughts, which compounded the misery of farmers. In March 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office, the United States was in an economic crisis.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war.
Aggressor nations were on the march as the 30s progressed. Japan invaded Manchuria and continued its quest for empire with the invasion of China in 1936. The world stood by as Japan carried out a campaign against civilian targets, leaving misery and carnage in its wake. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. The Nazi Party and the military were indistinguishable. The Spanish Civil War in 1937 served as a blueprint for Hitler's World War II strategies 2 years later. Like the Japanese invasion of China, the Spanish Civil War involved wide-scale bombing of civilian targets, resulting in massive loss of life among ordinary citizens. Adolf Hitler was the one man who could choose between war and peace in the coming decade. 1940 to 1949. World War II, the first war that killed more civilians than soldiers, dominated the decade. New technology raised the stakes, and for the first time, the world confronted the possibility of its own annihilation. France fell to Germany. By 1940, England, under the helm of Winston Churchill, stood alone against the Nazis.
We shall fight on, unconquerable, until the curse of Hitler is lifted.
Churchill met several times with Franklin Roosevelt to urge the U.S. to help the British war effort. Roosevelt's decision to end the war was forced on him in 1941 when the Japanese unexpectedly attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live
in infamy.
The whole country marshaled its resources behind the war effort. Women were recruited to work in factories, and Rosie the Riveter was born. The United States carried on a two-front war, fighting the Japanese in the Pacific and the other Axis powers in Europe. By the end of the 1944 D-Day invasion of France and the 1945 Battle of Iwo Jima, the tide had turned for the Allies. The war ended only after the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic age was underway. The end of the war was cause for celebration, and big band music provided the soundtrack. After the war, Americans returned to the national pastime, avidly following the rivalry between Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Major League Baseball finally reflected America when African-American Jackie Robinson integrated the sport in 1947. The NATO Pact was signed, and the world was divided between the democracies of the West and the communist countries of the East. The triumph of the Chinese Communist Revolution and Churchill's Iron Curtain speech made it clear the Cold War had begun.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
1950 to 1959. The 50s were a time of prosperity. Suburbs sprawled out from cities. A baby boom was underway, and the lines between the West and the East were clearly drawn by the Cold War. It was the era of the drive-in everything. The glamour of the 50s was personified by two American blondes, film stars Marilyn Monroe and Grace Kelly. Kelly became Princess Grace when she married Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1956. Young Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England at the age of 25 in 1952. Dwight Eisenhower was President of the U.S. for most of the decade. First elected in 1952, Eisenhower and Vice Presidential running mate Richard Nixon easily won re-election 4 years later. The dreaded disease polio was vanquished with the invention of a vaccine in 1955. President Eisenhower was forced to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision outlawing segregated schools. China, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union were under communist rule, and international events were colored by the Cold War. The Korean War was a classic Cold War confrontation. The United States supported the South, while China and the Soviet Union backed the North. In the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy urged the investigation of communist infiltration of America.
We should remember that practically every issue which we face today, from high taxes to the shameful mess in Korea, is inextricably interwoven with the communist issue.
In Hungary, the Soviet Union clamped down on dissidents, and Cuba fell to communism after rebel leader Fidel Castro claimed victory. With the Soviet launch of Sputnik, space became a desired destination, and the race for space soon took hold of the popular imagination. In the next decade, man would head for the moon. 1960 to 1969. The 60s were the era of youth, the age of Kennedy, the Beatles, and toward the end of the decade, young hippies dropping out and urging love, not war. President Kennedy charmed the beleaguered citizens of Berlin with his now famous words.
I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The shining moment of the civil rights movement was the 1963 March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
November 22nd, 1963. The assassination of John F. Kennedy. A horrible moment etched in the minds of a generation.
And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain.
The promise of the early 60s gave way to a loss of innocence as cities erupted in riots, and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy fell to assassins' bullets. The increasing involvement of the U.S. in Vietnam was paralleled by the intensity of protests against the war. President Kennedy set the goal.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And that goal was met in 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
By decade's end, seeing the Earth from another planet reminded us of its frailty and gave us a new perspective. 1970 to 1979. In the 70s, the world focused on the Middle East. Longtime enemies, Egypt and Israel, signed a peace treaty, while the oil crisis highlighted Western dependence on petroleum. It was also a decade of questionable fashions, questionable music, and questionable ethics. 4 students were shot dead at Kent State in Ohio during the 1970 protests against the American involvement in Vietnam. When the last American troops finally pulled out of Vietnam, the frenzy at the U.S. Embassy stunned television audiences. President Nixon resigned in the face of mounting allegations over his role in the break-in at Democratic campaign headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C.
know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Gerald Ford, who had replaced Vice President Agnew, became president without ever having run in a presidential election.
Our long national nightmare is over.
The United States celebrated its bicentennial in 1976. Boston schools were forced to integrate through mandatory busing. Jimmy Carter's presidency began with a note of populism as he broke with tradition and walked down Pennsylvania Avenue. The oil embargo caused us to examine recycling and conservation. President Carter negotiated an historic peace between Egypt and Israel. After the Iranian Revolution, hostages were taken at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. President Carter spent the remainder of his term trying to secure their release. That freedom would not come until the next decade. 1980 to 1989. The 80s have been called the decade of greed. Wall Street experienced a boom. Huge profits were made, and some of the gains were ill-gotten. The disparities between rich and poor were painfully clear, despite the heartfelt efforts of celebrities and charities. Millions of television viewers watched the 1981 fairy tale wedding between Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer. A leak of lethal gas in 1984 at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, killed hundreds. The 1986 disaster at the Chernobyl power plant in the Soviet Union was the largest nuclear catastrophe the world had ever seen. The 1986 Iran-Contra scandal shook the Reagan administration.
I just have to believe that they're going to be found innocent because I don't think they were guilty of any law-breaking or any crime.
Reusable spaceships made flights to space seem almost routine until the shuttle Challenger exploded at liftoff, killing all 7 of its crew.
Your families and your country mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
Major events occurred in the Cold War. Eastern Europe began to break free from the Soviet Union, just as changes in Soviet politics spelled the end of the Soviet Union altogether. Dictators and the terrorists they supported became the new global villains. China stood alone, making its anti-democracy position clear with a crackdown on student dissidents at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Despite all the advances in technology, we were still helpless in the face of a mysterious illness, AIDS. 1990 to 1994. South Africa held its first all-race elections and ushered in a new, exciting era under the helm of President Nelson Mandela. Elsewhere in Africa, ethnic divisions threatened to tear apart Rwanda and Somalia. In 1991, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded Kuwait and was soon crushed by a massive international effort led by the U.S. Also in 1991, the Soviet Union ended as it began, with a coup. Boris Yeltsin marshaled the support of pro-democracy Russians to defeat a coup of army insiders determined to overthrow President Gorbachev. In the aftermath of the failed coup, Gorbachev disbanded the Communist Party.
Of a free and sovereign nation.
Despite President George Bush's popularity after the Gulf War, he was defeated in the 1992 election by the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. Nationalism and ethnic conflicts threatened to tear Europe apart for the third time in the century as civil war engulfed the former Yugoslavia. This century bore witness to amazing technological advances, stunning changes in the people, places, and events that shaped our times.